The silence on Research Station Kepler 442b was the kind that made your skin crawl. Dr. Elena Vasquez pressed her face against the reinforced observation deck window, watching the alien sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and amber. 3 months into her xenobiology assignment, she still marveled at the beauty of this world, even as its dangers kept her awake at night. Elena was 26 years old, fresh out of her doctor program at Luna University, and arguably the youngest xenobiologist ever assigned to a frontier research station. Her specialty was predator-prey relationships in alien ecosystems, which made her the perfect candidate for studying the apex predators of this particular world. What made her less perfect was her complete lack of field experience with anything more dangerous than Earth's house cats. The research station sat perched on a rocky outcropping, surrounded by the dense, bioluminescent forest that covered most of the planet's northern continent. The trees here grew in impossible spirals, their bark glowing with soft blue patterns that pulsed like heartbeats in the growing darkness. It was beautiful, mesmerizing, and, according to her research, absolutely crawling with creatures that could kill her in dozens of creative ways. Another exciting evening on Paradise, Elena muttered to herself, turning away from the window. The station was small, designed for a crew of 12, but budget cuts had left her with only 3 companions. Dr. Marcus Chun handled atmospheric studies, while twin Sarah and David Kowalski managed the station's technical systems. All 3 were experienced frontier researchers, which made Elena feel like the intern who had somehow wandered into the wrong job. The main laboratory hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced technology. Holographic displays showed real-time data feeds from sensors scattered throughout the surrounding forest. Temperature readings, atmospheric composition, seismic activity, and, most importantly for Elena's work, movement patterns of the local wildlife. The computers had cataloged 47 distinct species in their immediate vicinity, ranging from tiny insectoid creatures that glowed like living jewels to massive herbivores that could step on a human without noticing. But it was the predators that kept Elena's attention. The sensors had detected 3 major predatory species in their area, each more formidable than anything Earth had produced. The thornbacks were massive, armored creatures that hunted alone, using their razor-sharp spinal projections to impale prey. The shadowmaws were pack hunters that could phase partially out of normal space-time, making them nearly impossible to track until they struck. And then there were the Kythera. Elena pulled up the data file on the Kythera, her heart rate increasing slightly as she read through her own notes. In the 3 months since arriving, she had never seen one of these creatures directly, but the evidence of their presence was everywhere. Claw marks on trees 30 feet off the ground. Bones of massive herbivores snapped like twigs and arranged in complex patterns. Territorial markings that seemed to follow mathematical principles no Earth predator would understand. The Kythera were described in the Colonial Survey reports as wolf-like, but Elena knew that description barely scratched the surface. They stood nearly 8 feet tall at the shoulder, with elongated limbs that could extend or contract at will. Their fur shifted color like liquid mercury, and their eyes glowed with an intelligence that made seasoned colonial marines nervous. They were pack hunters, but unlike Earth wolves, their packs could coordinate across vast distances using some form of quantum entanglement that scientists still didn't understand. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to enjoy the hunt itself. Other predators killed for food, territory, or protection. The Kythera killed for the sheer pleasure of it, often leaving their prey alive just long enough to experience true terror before delivering the final blow. Colonial settlements had learned to abandon entire regions rather than face sustained Kythera attention. Elena, you need to see this. She turned to find Marcus Chun standing in the doorway, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious anxiety. Marcus was 43, a veteran of 6 frontier assignments, and Elena had never seen him look nervous about anything. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, following him back to the main sensor array. "I've been monitoring atmospheric disturbances all day," Marcus said, pointing to a holographic display that showed wind patterns across their region. "Something's been moving through the forest in a coordinated pattern. Something big." Elena leaned closer to examine the data. The sensors tracked air displacement caused by large objects moving through the forest canopy. What she saw made her blood run cold. The patterns weren't random animal movement. They were tactical formations, moving in precise geometric shapes that suggested intelligence and coordination. How many? Elena asked, though she already suspected the answer. At least 12 contacts, Marcus replied. Possibly more. They've been circling us for the past 6 hours, always staying just outside our visual range. Elena felt her stomach drop. 12 was exactly the size of a full Kithra hunting pack. The creatures rarely gathered in such numbers unless they were preparing for a major hunt, something that would require their full attention and coordination. Have you told the twins? Elena asked. They're in the communications array, trying to reach the colonial authorities, Marcus said. But the nearest military outpost is 3 days away, and we both know these things won't wait 3 days. Elena nodded grimly. She had read the reports from other research stations that had encountered active Kithra packs. The creatures seemed to take special pleasure in hunting isolated human settlements, particularly ones that couldn't fight back effectively. Research stations, with their minimal defensive capabilities and small crews, were perfect targets. What about the emergency protocols? Elena asked. Marcus gestured toward the station's defensive systems with obvious frustration. We have a basic energy shield that might keep out smaller predators and a few emergency beacons. Nothing that would stop a determined Kithra pack. The designers assumed we'd evacuate long before any serious predators took interest in us. Elena walked back to the observation window, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The bioluminescent trees pulsed in their regular rhythm, but she could see nothing beyond their gentle glow. She knew the creatures were out there, watching, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike. The thought made her feel helpless and angry in equal measure. She had spent her entire academic career studying predators from the safety of lecture halls and laboratory simulations. She could recite the hunting patterns of Earth's greatest carnivores, analyze the social structures of pack hunters, and predict prey responses with mathematical precision. But standing here, knowing that she was about to become prey herself, all of that theoretical knowledge felt utterly useless. Elena, Sarah Kowalski's voice came through the intercom system. You need to get to the communications center. Now. Elena and Marcus exchanged glances before hurrying through the station's narrow corridors. The communications center was located in the station's most secure section, surrounded by additional shielding and backup power systems. They found Sarah and David hunched over the main communication console, their faces pale in the glow of various warning displays. Tell me you reached the colonial authorities, Elena said. We did, David said without looking up from his console. The bad news is that the nearest rapid response team is 72 hours away. The worst news is that we just lost our primary communications array. Lost to how? Marcus asked. Sarah pointed to an external monitoring screen that showed the station's communication dish. The massive metal structure, which had been perfectly intact an hour earlier, was now twisted and broken. Metal fragments were scattered across the rocky ground below, and deep claw marks were visible on what remained of the support structure. They took it out surgically, Sarah said, cut through the support cables, and destroyed the primary transmission array while leaving the power systems intact. It's like they knew exactly what to target. Elena stared at the ruined communications array, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. The precision of the attack suggested intelligence beyond what most colonial reports attributed to the Kithra. These creatures had studied their target, identified the station's critical systems, and eliminated their ability to call for help without triggering any automated alarms. How long until they make their move? Elena asked. Based on previous attack patterns, David said, consulting his tactical database, Kithra packs typically observe their target for 8 to 12 hours before initiating direct assault. They've been watching us for 6 hours, so we probably have until dawn. Elena looked around at her 3 companions, seeing her own fear reflected in their faces. Marcus was the oldest and most experienced, but his expertise was in atmospheric analysis, not combat. The twins were brilliant engineers, but they were researchers, not soldiers. And Elena herself was a xenobiologist who had never faced anything more dangerous than an angry laboratory rat. What are our options? Elena asked. Marcus pulled up a schematic of the station's defensive systems. We can activate the emergency shields, but They're designed to keep out smaller creatures and environmental hazards. A full Kithra pack could probably break through in minutes. We have emergency rations for 2 weeks, but no weapons beyond basic maintenance tools. What about evacuation? Elena asked. The nearest safe zone is the colonial settlement at New Geneva, Sarah said. That's 200 kilometers through dense forest filled with predators. In an emergency shuttle, we might make it, but the Kithra would track us the entire way, Elena finished. And a shuttle crash in hostile territory would be a death sentence. David nodded grimly. Colonial protocol for this situation is to hunker down, activate all defensive systems, and wait for rescue. Hope that the creatures lose interest or find easier prey. Elena walked back to the main laboratory, her mind racing through everything she knew about Kithra behavior. The creatures were intelligent, patient, and absolutely ruthless. They didn't lose interest in prey they had selected, and they certainly didn't give up because their targets had locked themselves behind energy shields. If anything, the challenge would make the hunt more enjoyable for them. She pulled up her research files again, scanning through months of behavioral analysis. Somewhere in all this data, there had to be something useful, some weakness or pattern that could give them an advantage. The problem was that most of the available information came from colonial settlements that had been completely destroyed. Dead researchers couldn't file very detailed reports. Elena. Marcus appeared beside her, his voice quiet. There's something else you should know. She looked up from her data screens. What? I've been analyzing the atmospheric readings from the attack on our communications array, Marcus said. The chemical signatures suggest the creatures were using some kind of bioelectric enhancement. Their natural abilities are being artificially amplified. Elena felt her heart sink even further. Enhanced Kithra were almost mythical creatures in colonial folklore, pack hunters that had been exposed to certain types of exotic radiation or bioelectric fields. They were faster, stronger, more intelligent, and far more aggressive than normal specimens. And they were standing outside her research station, planning her death. How enhanced are we talking about? Elena asked. Marcus consulted his readings. Based on the energy signatures, I'd estimate their physical capabilities have been increased by at least 40%. Their coordination and intelligence could be enhanced even more than that. Elena stared at the data, feeling the full weight of their situation settling on her shoulders. They were 4 unarmed researchers, trapped in a lightly defended station, being hunted by an enhanced pack of the galaxy's most efficient predators. The Kithra would take their time, savor the hunt, and ensure that each of them experienced maximum terror before the end. But as Elena continued reading through her research files, a strange thought occurred to her. Every report she had read focused on the Kithra's intelligence, their coordination, their enhanced senses, and physical capabilities. But none of the reports mentioned what happened when the creatures encountered genuine resistance. Not just defensive shields or emergency protocols, but actual determined resistance from their prey. The reason was simple. Humans rarely fought back. When faced with Kithra, the standard colonial response was to evacuate, call for military support, or hide behind defensive systems. Humans were civilized, rational people who had moved beyond the need for personal violence. They built technology to fight their battles, relied on institutions to protect them, and generally assumed that intelligence and preparation were sufficient to handle any threat. But what if they weren't sufficient? What if, for once, humans had to rely on something older and more primitive than their technology? Elena found herself thinking about Earth's evolutionary history, about the ancestors who had survived ice ages and predators far more dangerous than anything the Kithra had faced. Humans hadn't reached the top of their world's food chain through superior technology. They had gotten there by being more stubborn, more vicious, and more willing to fight than anything else on the planet. The thought was terrifying and oddly comforting at the same time. Elena looked around the laboratory, seeing her situation with new eyes. Yes, they were trapped and outnumbered by superior predators. But they weren't helpless. They were humans, descendants of creatures that had survived everything their death world could throw at them. The question was whether that ancient heritage would be enough to save them when the real hunt began. The attack began at 0347 hours, 3 minutes before dawn. Elena had spent the night poring over every piece of data they had about Kithra hunting patterns, looking for some weakness or behavioral quirk that might give them an advantage. She had found nothing useful. The creatures were nearly perfect predators, evolved over millions of years to hunt and kill with ruthless efficiency. Their only weakness seemed to be overconfidence, but that wasn't much help when you were actually inferior to your opponent in every measurable way. The first sign of trouble was a subsonic humming that made Elena's teeth ache. She looked up from her research terminal to see Marcus pointing frantically at the seismic sensors. The devices were registering coordinated vibrations from 12 distinct points around the station, all moving in a complex spiral pattern that was slowly tightening. "They're using some kind of harmonic resonance," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear, testing the structural integrity of the station's foundation. Elena watched the sensor displays with growing horror. The Kithara weren't just attacking randomly. They were conducting a systematic engineering analysis, looking for weak points in the station's construction. It was the kind of tactical thinking that military units used before assaulting hardened positions. "How long before they find what they're looking for?" Elena asked. "Based on the pattern complexity, maybe 10 minutes, Marcus replied. "These creatures understand our technology better than our own engineers." The subsonic humming stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt even more threatening. Elena held her breath, straining to hear any sound from outside the station. Nothing. Even in normal forest, sounds had disappeared, leaving them in a bubble of absolute quiet. Then the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a few seconds later, bathing the laboratory in red warning lights. But the primary power grid was completely dead, along with most of their defensive systems. Elena heard Sarah swearing creatively in the communication center as backup systems began shutting down one by one. They cut the main power coupling. David's voice came through the intercom. "Surgically removed it without damaging anything else. We're running on battery backup now." Elena felt a cold knot of fear forming in her stomach. The Kithara had first eliminated their communications, then studied their defenses, and now they had crippled the station's power systems. Each attack had been precisely calculated to minimize their options without actually harming them. The creatures were setting up for a prolonged hunt, ensuring their prey couldn't escape or call for help. "How long do the batteries last?" Elena asked. 6 hours on minimal power, David replied. "Less if we try to run any defensive systems." Elena was about to respond when something massive struck the station's outer hull. The entire structure shook, and she could hear the distinctive sound of claws scraping against reinforced metal. More impacts followed, each one from a different direction, as if the creatures were testing the station's structural integrity through direct physical contact. Through the observation window, Elena caught her first glimpse of their attackers. A Kithara moved past the window in a flowing, liquid motion that seemed to defy physics. The creature was even larger than the colonial reports had suggested, easily 10 feet tall, and built like a nightmare fusion of wolf and shadow. Its fur shifted color constantly, flowing from silver to black to deep purple as it moved. When it turned toward the window, Elena found herself staring into eyes that glowed with cold intelligence. The creature tilted its head, studying her with obvious curiosity. Elena forced herself to meet its gaze, even as every instinct screamed at her to hide. The Kithara's mouth opened in what might have been a smile, revealing teeth like obsidian daggers. Then it moved on, continuing its systematic inspection of the station's defenses. "Elena, get away from that window," Marcus called. "These things are studying us just as much as we're studying them." Elena stepped back, but she couldn't shake the memory of those intelligent eyes. The creature hadn't looked at her like she was prey. It had looked at her like she was a puzzle to be solved. The thought was somehow more terrifying than simple predatory hunger. More impacts shook the station as the pack continued its assault. But Elena was beginning to recognize a pattern in the attacks. The creatures weren't trying to break in immediately. They were conducting what could only be described as psychological warfare, applying pressure in calculated doses to maximize their prey's fear and desperation. "They're playing with us," Elena said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "What?" Marcus asked. "Look at the attack pattern," Elena said, pulling up the sensor data. "They could have breached the outer hull 20 minutes ago. Instead, they're taking their time, letting us know exactly how helpless we are. They're enjoying this. Marcus studied the data, his face pale in the red emergency lighting. You're right. This isn't a hunt, it's entertainment. Elena felt anger beginning to replace her fear. She had read about this aspect of Kithra behavior in the colonial reports, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The creatures weren't just predators. They were sadists who took genuine pleasure in the suffering of their prey. They would keep the humans alive for hours, possibly days, feeding on their terror before finally ending the game. Not if I can help it, Elena muttered. She walked to the equipment locker and began pulling out maintenance tools. Plasma cutters, molecular welders, gravitic manipulators. None of them were designed as weapons, but Elena had spent years studying predator behavior. She understood that the most dangerous prey were the ones that fought back unpredictably. Elena, what are you doing? Marcus asked. I'm going to give them something they're not expecting, Elena replied, checking the power cell on a plasma cutter. Every report about Kithra attacks has one thing in common. The prey always reacted exactly as expected. They hid, they ran, they called for help. They never actually fought back. Marcus stared at her in disbelief. You want to fight them? Elena, these creatures have been hunting dangerous prey for millions of years. We're just soft academics with no combat training. Exactly, Elena said, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. We're not supposed to be dangerous. That's our advantage. She activated the intercom system. Sarah, David, I need you to meet me in the main laboratory. And bring every piece of heavy equipment you can carry. The twins arrived a few minutes later, armed with an assortment of engineering tools and looking confused. Elena quickly explained her theory while the Kithra continued their psychological assault on the station's outer defenses. You're talking about guerrilla warfare against apex predators, Sarah said. Elena, these things hunt in coordinated packs. They have enhanced senses, natural weapons, and tactical intelligence. We have maintenance tools. We also have something they don't expect, Elena replied. Desperation and human stupidity. Every successful predator has behavioral patterns, instincts that have been reinforced by millions of years of evolution. The Kithra expect their prey to behave in certain ways. When we don't, we become unpredictable. Another massive impact shook the station, followed by the distinctive sound of claws scraping against metal. But this time, Elena heard something else underneath the sound. A low rumbling that might have been communication between the pack members. They're getting ready to make their move, Elena said. We have maybe 10 minutes before they breach the outer hull. She handed plasma cutters to Marcus and the twins, keeping a molecular welder for herself. The tools were designed for precision work on delicate equipment, but Elena knew they could also cut through Kithra hide. The question was whether they would have a chance to use them. What's the plan? David asked. Elena looked around the laboratory, her mind racing through possibilities. The station's layout was designed for efficiency, not defense. Long corridors, open spaces, and multiple access points that would give the Kithra every advantage. But there were also maintenance shafts, service tunnels, and ventilation systems that humans could use, but larger predators might find difficult to navigate. We're going to split up and make them hunt us individually, Elena said. Force them to break pack formation and engage us in spaces where their size and coordination work against them. That's suicide, Marcus said flatly. No, Elena replied. Suicide is sitting here waiting for them to breach our defenses and kill us at their leisure. At least this way we have a chance to take some of them with us. She could see the fear in her companions' faces, but also something else. Determination. The same stubborn refusal to give up that had carried humanity through every crisis in their history. They were terrified, but they were also angry, and anger was something Elena could work with. Marcus, you take the atmospheric processing section, Elena said. Lots of pipes and machinery they'll have trouble navigating. Sarah, the power distribution center has narrow access tunnels. David, the communications array basement has multiple exit points. What about you? Sarah asked. Elena looked toward the main laboratory's observation deck. I'm going to the one place they won't expect me to go. Out there with them. The others stared at her in shock. Elena, that's insane, Marcus said. Is it? Elena asked. They've spent hours studying this station's defenses, mapping every corridor and access point. But They've been doing it from the outside. They don't know the interior layout as well as we do. And they certainly don't expect their prey to come hunting them. Elena activated the station's internal communication system one last time. Remember, the goal isn't to win a fair fight. It's to survive long enough to make them reconsider whether we're worth the trouble. Humans didn't conquer Earth by being the strongest or fastest. We did it by being too stubborn to know when we were beaten. A new sound echoed through the station, metal tearing under enormous pressure. The Kithara had finally decided to end their psychological games and begin the real hunt. Elena could hear claws clicking against metal floors as the creatures moved through the outer sections of the station. "Go," Elena whispered. "And remember, they expect prey. Give them predators instead." The others nodded and scattered toward their assigned positions. Elena waited until she was alone in the laboratory before making her way toward the station's main airlock. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, and her hands were slick with sweat, but her mind felt strangely clear. She had spent her entire career studying predator behavior from the safety of academic institutions. Now she was about to get a practical education in what it meant to be hunted by creatures that had evolved to kill. But she was also about to teach them something about human nature that no alien predator had ever experienced. Elena activated the airlock controls and stepped out into the alien night, a molecular welder in one hand and 26 years of suppressed human aggression in her heart. The first Kithara she encountered seemed as surprised as she was. The Kithara standing 20 feet from the station's airlock was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure. Under the alien stars, its fur rippled with bioluminescent patterns that shifted like oil on water. The creature had been examining something on the ground, possibly tracks or scent markers, when Elena emerged from the station. For a long moment, predator and prey stared at each other in mutual surprise. Elena's first coherent thought was that the colonial reports had understated everything about these creatures. The Kithara was easily 11 feet tall, with limbs that seemed too long and joints that bent in directions that shouldn't be possible. Its head was wolf-like, but elongated, with ears that could rotate independently, and eyes that reflected the starlight like polished silver coins. When it opened its mouth, Elena counted at least 40 teeth, each one designed for a different aspect of killing. But what struck her most was the intelligence in those alien eyes. This wasn't a simple predator operating on instinct. This was a thinking creature, one that was currently trying to process why its prey had voluntarily left the safety of its den. The Kithara tilted its head, studying Elena with obvious confusion. Its packmates were somewhere inside the station, beginning their systematic hunt of the other humans. This creature had been assigned to guard the perimeter, preventing any escape attempts. It had not been prepared for one of its prey to simply walk outside and present itself. Elena raised the molecular welder, its energy field crackling to life with a sound like breaking glass. The Kithara's eyes focused on the tool, and Elena could see it trying to categorize this new element in its tactical situation. The creature had undoubtedly studied human technology during its observations of the station. But a molecular welder wasn't designed as a weapon, and Elena could see the predator struggling to assess the threat level. "Come on then," Elena said quietly. "Let's see how well you hunt when your prey hunts back." The Kithara made a sound that was part growl and part something else entirely. A complex vocalization that seemed to contain multiple harmonic frequencies. Elena realized it was communicating with its packmates inside the station, reporting this unexpected development. Elena didn't wait for the pack to coordinate a response. She lunged forward, swinging the molecular welder in a wide arc toward the creature's nearest limb. The Kithara moved with liquid grace, flowing backward faster than Elena's eyes could track. But the energy field from the welder caught the edge of the creature's forearm, and Elena heard a sharp hiss as molecular bonds were disrupted. The Kithara looked down at its arm in obvious surprise. A thin line of what might have been blood was visible on its fur, glowing with the same bioluminescent properties as the rest of its body. The creature examined the wound with the analytical attention of a scientist studying an unexpected experimental result. Elena pressed her advantage, moving forward again with the welder held like a sword. The Kithara backed away, but Elena could see it was no longer confused. The predator's body language had shifted from puzzled curiosity to focused attention. It was beginning to treat her as an actual threat rather than escaping prey. The creature circled to Elena's left, moving with the fluid motion of water flowing around an obstacle. Elena turned to keep it in front of her, but she was already learning that human reflexes were no match for Kithra's speed. The alien predator could move in directions, and at speeds that made her feel like she was fighting in slow motion. But Elena had advantages that the creature didn't understand yet. She knew the terrain around the research station better than the Kithra did. More importantly, she was fighting with the desperate creativity that came from having nothing left to lose. When the Kithra lunged at her, Elena didn't try to dodge. Instead, she dropped to the ground and rolled toward the creature, bringing the molecular welder up in an arc that intersected with the predator's belly. The Kithra twisted in midair, avoiding most of the energy field, but Elena managed to score another glancing hit. The creature landed badly, favoring its left side where the welder had disrupted tissue at the molecular level. Elena scrambled to her feet, breathing hard but feeling a surge of savage satisfaction. She had hurt it, not badly, but enough to prove that humans weren't helpless prey. The Kithra made another complex vocalization, this one with distinctly different harmonic patterns. Elena had studied enough predator communication to recognize a warning call when she heard one. The creature was telling its packmates that the situation had changed, that the prey was more dangerous than expected. From inside the station, Elena could hear the sound of her plan beginning to work. Marcus had found the atmospheric processing section, and the sound of plasma cutting through metal suggested he was making the Kithra pay for every inch of corridor they tried to claim. Somewhere else, she could hear the distinctive whine of engineering equipment being used in ways its designers never intended. But Elena's attention was focused on her immediate opponent. The creature had stopped circling and was now approaching directly, its body low to the ground in a hunting crouch. Elena could see muscles bunching under its fur as it prepared for another attack. This time, Elena was ready. When the Kithra leaped, she didn't try to meet it head-on. Instead, she dove to her right toward a cluster of sensor equipment that rose from the rocky ground like metal trees. The predator's claws scraped sparks from the rock where she had been standing. Elena came up running, weaving between the sensor arrays while the Kithra crashed through equipment that had been designed to withstand hurricane-force winds. The creature was stronger and faster, but Elena was smaller and more agile in confined spaces. She could use the sensor forest like a three-dimensional maze, forcing the predator to navigate obstacles while she planned her next attack. The Kithra seemed to understand her strategy almost immediately. It stopped chasing her directly and began systematically destroying the sensor equipment, clearing the terrain to eliminate her advantage. Elena watched with growing dismay as claws that could cut through reinforced metal made short work of the delicate instruments. But the creature's focus on the equipment gave Elena an opportunity she hadn't expected. While the Kithra was destroying a particularly large sensor array, Elena managed to circle around behind it. The molecular welder hummed as she brought it down toward the creature's spine. The Kithra spun around faster than Elena thought possible, catching her wrist in a grip that felt like being grabbed by a hydraulic press. For a moment, they were face to face, close enough that Elena could smell the alien musk of the creature's fur and feel its breath against her face. The predator's eyes were inches from her own, studying her with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. Elena realized that the creature was learning from this encounter, analyzing her tactics and capabilities with the same scientific curiosity that she brought to her own research. They were studying each other, predator and prey, locked in a mutual examination that would determine who lived and who died. Elena brought her knee up toward what she hoped was a vulnerable spot on the creature's anatomy. The Kithra released her wrist and flowed backward, but not quite fast enough. Elena's knee connected with something that felt like armor plating, but the impact made the creature hiss in what might have been pain. Elena landed hard, rolling backward as claws whistled through the air where her head had been. She came up in a crouch, the molecular welder still clutched in her hand, and found herself facing a predator that no longer viewed her as easy prey. The Kithra was breathing harder now, and Elena could see several wounds where the welder had disrupted its tissue. More importantly, The creature's body language had changed completely. It was no longer hunting. It was fighting for its life against an opponent that had proven capable of inflicting real damage. The sound of combat from inside the station was intensifying. Elena could hear Marcus shouting something that might have been a battle cry, followed by the distinctive sound of a plasma cutter being used at maximum power. Sarah, or David, was doing something with heavy machinery that made the entire station shake. But Elena's packmates weren't the only ones fighting. The Kithara inside the station were also making sounds now, complex vocalizations that suggested they were encountering unexpected resistance. The humans weren't behaving like normal prey. They were fighting back with a ferocity that the predators hadn't anticipated. Elena's immediate opponent made what sounded like a decision. It backed away from her, its posture shifting from aggressive to cautious. For a moment, Elena thought the creature might actually retreat. Then, she heard it make a new vocalization, one with distinctly different harmonic patterns. The sound was answered from multiple directions around the station. Elena's heart sank as she realized what was happening. The Kithara pack was abandoning their individual hunts and converging on her position. She had proven dangerous enough to require the attention of the entire pack. Elena looked around the ruined sensor field, calculating distances and angles. She was outnumbered, outgunned, and about to face the kind of coordinated assault that had wiped out entire colonial settlements. But she was also angrier than she had ever been in her life, and anger was making her think in ways that her academic training never could have prepared her for. When the first backup Kithara emerged from the forest, Elena was already moving. She had learned enough about their tactics to know that the pack would try to surround her before attacking. But she also knew something about human tactics that no alien predator had ever encountered. Sometimes, the best defense was a completely insane offense. Elena charged directly toward the largest concentration of Kithara, the molecular welder shrieking as she brought it to maximum power. Behind her, she could hear her packmates fighting their own battles inside the station. Ahead of her, she could see alien predators that had never faced prey that refused to act like prey. It was time to teach them about human nature. See, Elena's charge caught the Kithara pack completely off guard. In millions of years of evolutionary development, they had never encountered prey that responded to overwhelming odds by attacking. Their tactical programming, honed by countless successful hunts, simply had no framework for dealing with such behavior. The lead Kithara, a massive specimen with scars covering its muzzle, actually froze for a crucial second as Elena ran directly toward it. That second of confusion was all Elena needed. The molecular welder caught the creature across its chest, disrupting tissue at the atomic level and sending the predator stumbling backward with a sound that was part roar and part surprise. Elena didn't stop to admire her work. She rolled under the claws of a second Kithara, came up running, and vaulted over a fallen sensor array toward the edge of the forest. Behind her, she could hear the pack reorganizing, their confusion rapidly giving way to coordinated pursuit. But Elena wasn't running away. She was leading them exactly where she wanted them to go. The maintenance tunnel entrance was hidden among the roots of one of the larger spiral trees, barely visible unless you knew where to look. Elena had memorized the location during her first week at the station, part of the mandatory safety briefing that she had never expected to use. The tunnel connected to the station's geothermal power system, running underground for nearly 100 meters through a space too narrow for the larger Kithara to navigate easily. Elena dove through the tunnel entrance just as claws raked the air where her head had been. The space was barely wide enough for a human, lined with power conduits and maintenance equipment that created a three-dimensional obstacle course. Behind her, she could hear the frustrated sounds of predators trying to follow prey into a space designed for much smaller creatures. The tunnel was dark, lit only by the emergency power indicators on various pieces of equipment. Elena moved by feel and memory, crawling through sections where the ceiling was too low for running. The molecular welder was almost useless in such confined space, but Elena had other tools now. Power conduits that could be overloaded, coolant pipes that could be ruptured, and structural supports that could be weakened in strategically useful ways. She could hear at least two Kithara behind her, struggling through a passage that was clearly too small for their enhanced forms. The creatures were making sounds of frustration and Anger, no longer the controlled vocalizations of coordinated hunters. Elena had forced them to abandon their pack tactics and engage her individually in an environment where their advantages meant nothing. Elena reached the first junction and made a quick decision. Instead of continuing toward the station, she turned left into the secondary power distribution tunnel. This passage was even narrower, but it led to something that might give her a real advantage in this fight. The station's geothermal tap was located 50 meters below ground, where superheated steam from the planet's core was converted into electrical power. The entire system was automated and heavily shielded, designed to operate for decades without maintenance. It was also, Elena realized, a perfect trap for creatures that had evolved on a world with different atmospheric and pressure conditions. Elena found the manual override panel for the pressure release system, a failsafe designed to prevent dangerous steam buildup in the primary conduits. Under normal circumstances, activating the emergency release would simply vent excess pressure harmlessly into the atmosphere. But if someone were to disable the primary safety interlocks first, behind her, Elena could hear the Kithra getting closer. Their breathing was labored now, the confined space and pursuit clearly taking a toll on creatures designed for open hunting grounds. She could also hear scraping sounds that suggested they were having to force their way through sections of the tunnel by sheer strength. Elena found the safety interlock panel and began systematically disabling the protection systems. Her xenobiology training hadn't covered engineering, but 3 months of living in a frontier research station had taught her enough about the basics. Disable the pressure sensors, override the temperature controls, and remove the automated cutoffs that prevented system overload. She had just finished with the last safety system when a massive Kithra claw punched through the tunnel wall behind her. The creature had apparently decided that stealth was less important than speed and was simply tearing its way through any obstacle that slowed its pursuit. Elena activated the manual pressure release and dove toward the next tunnel junction as superheated steam began venting into the confined space behind her. The sound was like a freight train derailing in slow motion, followed by alien screams that suggested the Kithra had just learned something unpleasant about geothermal energy. She emerged from the tunnel system through an access hatch near the station's main laboratory, gasping for breath and covered in dust and coolant fluid. The sounds of combat from inside the station had intensified, and Elena could hear Marcus somewhere in the atmosphere processing section doing something that involved a lot of creative swearing and what sounded like heavy machinery being used as weapons. But Elena's attention was focused on the remaining members of the Kithra pack. At least 6 of the creatures were visible around the station's perimeter, and their behavior had changed dramatically from the confident hunters she had first encountered. They were moving cautiously now, their pack formation loose and reactive rather than the tight coordination they had displayed earlier. More importantly, they were making new types of vocalizations. Elena had spent enough time studying pack hunters to recognize the sounds of confusion and reassessment. The Kithra were trying to understand how their perfectly planned hunt had turned into a chaotic melee with heavily armed prey that refused to behave according to established patterns. Elena could see 2 of the creatures near the station's main entrance, apparently debating whether to continue the assault or withdraw to regroup. Their body language suggested internal conflict, instincts warring with tactical analysis. They had been bred for millions of years to be perfect hunters, but perfection required predictable prey. Elena made a decision that would have horrified her academic advisors. Instead of retreating into the station to help her packmates, she began moving toward the 2 Kithra near the main entrance. The molecular welder was almost depleted, but she had found something better in the maintenance tunnels. A portable plasma torch designed for cutting through ship hulls, powered by a fusion cell that could run for hours. The first Kithra saw her coming and made a sound that Elena was beginning to recognize as a warning to its packmate. But the creature's response was defensive rather than aggressive. It backed away from Elena's approach, clearly uncertain how to handle prey that kept initiating combat. Elena activated the plasma torch, and a 3-foot beam of contained stellar fire erupted from the device. The light was bright enough to cast hard shadows in the alien dawn, and the heat was sufficient to melt most known metals. The Kithra's eyes widened as they processed this new threat level. That's right, Elena said, advancing on the two creatures with the plasma torch held like a sword. Still think we look like easy prey? The Kithara exchanged rapid vocalizations, clearly debating tactics. Elena could see them trying to circle her, but every time one of them moved to flank her position, she turned to face it with a plasma torch. The weapon had enough range to keep both creatures at a safe distance, and its cutting power was sufficient to seriously injure anything it touched. But Elena knew she was running on borrowed time. The plasma torch had impressive destructive capability, but it was also draining her fusion cell rapidly. And somewhere in the maintenance tunnels, she could hear sounds that suggested at least one Kithara had survived her geothermal trap and was working its way back toward the surface. The deadlock was broken by an explosion from inside the station. Elena spun around to see smoke pouring from the atmospheric processing section, followed by Marcus emerging through a broken window with what looked like a modified plasma cutter in each hand. His face was grim with determination, but Elena could see burns on his arms and tears in his clothing that suggested he had been having his own close encounters with alien predators. "Elena," Marcus shouted, "whatever you did to that geothermal system, it worked. I just finished off 2 of them in the processing center." Elena felt a surge of hope mixed with savage satisfaction. Her packmates were fighting back effectively, using human ingenuity and sheer bloody-minded stubbornness to turn the station into a death trap for their would-be hunters. But the Kithara were adaptive creatures, and Elena could see them beginning to reassess the situation. The 2 creatures near her made a series of rapid vocalizations, and Elena heard answering calls from around the station perimeter. The pack was pulling back, but not retreating. They were regrouping, probably planning a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the humans' improvised defenses. Elena looked around the battlefield, taking inventory of their situation. Marcus was armed and mobile but injured. She could hear Sarah and David somewhere in the station's interior, apparently still fighting their own battles. The Kithara pack had been reduced from 12 to perhaps 8 members, but the survivors had learned to respect human capabilities. More importantly, Elena realized that something fundamental had changed during the fight. She was no longer thinking of the Kithara as superior predators hunting helpless prey. She was thinking of them as competitors in a struggle that could go either way. The fear was still there, but it was balanced now by anger and a growing confidence in her own ability to survive. Elena looked at the plasma torch in her hands, then at Marcus with his improvised weapons, and finally at the Kithara pack regrouping in the forest beyond the station. The aliens had expected a simple hunt against soft academics. Instead, they had found themselves in a war against humans who refused to acknowledge that they were outmatched. "Marcus," Elena called, "how much ammunition do you have for those cutters?" "Enough for maybe 10 more minutes of continuous fire," Marcus replied. "But I've been thinking, if we can get to the main power coupling that they severed, I might be able to rig something that would make them reconsider this entire enterprise." Elena nodded, but her attention was focused on the Kithara pack leader. The scarred creature was studying them with obvious intelligence, probably calculating the cost-benefit ratio of continuing the assault. Elena could see the moment when the predator reached its decision. The pack leader made a complex vocalization that sounded different from anything Elena had heard before. It was answered by its packmates with sounds that suggested agreement or acknowledgement. Elena felt her heart sink as she realized what was happening. The Kithara weren't retreating or regrouping. They were calling for reinforcements. The reinforcements arrived within 20 minutes, emerging from the forest in perfect coordination like a nightmare made manifest. Elena counted at least 16 additional Kithara, bringing the total pack size to over 20 members. It was the largest hunting group ever recorded, and Elena realized with cold certainty that her small act of resistance had escalated far beyond what any of them had anticipated. But something was wrong with the newcomers. As Elena studied them through the laboratory's cracked observation window, she noticed that these Kithara were different from the original pack. Their fur was darker, their movements more aggressive, and their eyes held a kind of focused intensity that suggested combat experience rather than simple hunting instinct. "Those aren't just reinforcements," Elena said to Marcus, who was working frantically to repair their power coupling. "Those are soldiers." Marcus looked up from his improvised repairs. "Soldiers?" "Elena, these are animals. Predators, not warriors. No, Elena replied, watching the newcomers take up tactical positions around the station. Look at their formation. Look at the way they're coordinating with the original pack. These creatures have military organization. Marcus, we're not dealing with a hunting pack anymore. We're dealing with an army. Elena was beginning to understand something that the colonial reports had missed entirely. The Kithara weren't just apex predators that occasionally threatened human settlements. They were an intelligent species with their own society, their own military structures, and their own strategic objectives. What had started as a simple hunt for prey had become something much larger. Sarah's voice crackled through the intercom system. Elena, Marcus, you need to hear this. I've been monitoring their communications frequencies, and I'm picking up signals from at least 3 other locations. This isn't an isolated incident. There are Kithara forces moving against multiple human settlements across this entire sector. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't about 4 researchers trapped in a frontier station. This was about first contact between humans and an alien species that had decided humanity represented a threat worth eliminating. And they had just proven that humans were far more dangerous than anyone had realized. David, status report. Elena called through the intercom. I've managed to jury-rig some of our sensor equipment into early warning systems, David replied. And, Elena, you're not going to like this. The newcomers aren't just larger than the original pack. They're carrying equipment. Elena strained to see what David was talking about, and her heart sank as she spotted metallic objects attached to several of the larger Kithara. They weren't natural adaptations or biological enhancements. They were tools, weapons, technology that suggested a level of sophistication that had somehow escaped every colonial survey. How do we miss this? Elena asked, more to herself than to her companions. Because they wanted us to miss it, Marcus said grimly. Think about it, Elena. Every human settlement that's encountered Kithara has reported the same thing. Powerful predators that hunt in packs using natural abilities. But what if that was just what they wanted us to see? Elena stared at the assembled alien force, her mind racing through the implications. If Marcus was right, then humanity had been systematically deceived about the nature of the threat they faced. The Kithara had allowed humans to see them as animals rather than revealing their true technological capabilities. They had been conducting reconnaissance, while humans assumed they were dealing with simple predators. They've been studying us, Elena said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. All those attacks on settlements, all those encounters with colonial scouts, they weren't hunting expeditions. They were intelligence-gathering operations. The implications were staggering. If the Kithara had been studying human technology, tactics, and psychology for years, then they knew far more about humanity than humans knew about them. They understood human weaknesses, human responses to threat, and human defensive capabilities. This hunting pack had been sent to Elena Station not for food or territory, but to test something specific about human nature. And Elena had just given them a lesson they hadn't expected. Through the observation window, she could see the pack leader communicating with the newly arrived forces. The creature's body language suggested urgency, possibly even alarm. It was reporting something to its superiors, something about the human response that didn't match their predictions. They're arguing, Elena said, watching the alien exchange with growing interest. Marcus joined her at the window. About what? About us, Elena replied. Look at their postures, their vocalizations. The original pack is trying to explain why they haven't completed their mission. The newcomers are questioning their tactics. Elena was beginning to see patterns in the Kithara behavior that her academic training had prepared her to recognize. Pack dynamics, hierarchy disputes, and tactical disagreements. The creatures were having the same kind of strategic debate that human military units might have after encountering unexpected resistance. Elena, Sarah's voice came through the intercom with unmistakable excitement. I've been analyzing their communication frequencies, and I think I've figured out something important. They're not just talking to each other. They're transmitting to something else. Something big. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. A command ship? Maybe, Sarah replied. But the signal strength and complexity suggest something even larger. Elena, I think there's a Kithara fleet in this system. Elena stared out at the assembled alien forces. Finally, understanding the true scope of what they had stumbled into. This wasn't first contact. This was the opening move of an invasion. The Kithara had been preparing for a systematic assault on human space, using their reputation as simple predators to mask their true capabilities. But Elena and her companions had just demonstrated something that had apparently never occurred to the Kithara strategic planners. Humans didn't fight like any other species they had encountered. When faced with overwhelming odds, humans didn't surrender or flee. They got angry. And angry humans were apparently something the galaxy had never seen before. "David," Elena called through the intercom. "How long until you can get our emergency beacon working?" "Maybe another hour," David replied. "But, Elena, even if I get operational, the nearest military response is still days away." Elena looked around the laboratory at the improvised weapons and defensive systems her pack had created in a few hours of desperate fighting. Plasma cutters modified for combat use, maintenance tools converted into weapons, and a geothermal system rigged as a death trap. None of it was supposed to work against apex predators, but somehow they had not only survived, but actually inflicted casualties on their attackers. "We don't need the military to rescue us," Elena said, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. "We need them to record what happens here." Marcus stared at her. "Elena, what are you thinking?" Elena picked up the plasma torch, checking its power levels one more time. "I'm thinking that the Kithara chose the wrong species to underestimate. They expected prey. They found predators. And now they're about to learn something about human nature that's going to change everything." Through the observation window, Elena could see the alien forces preparing for what was obviously intended to be their final assault. Weapons were being readied, tactical positions established, and coordination protocols activated. The Kithara were bringing their full technological and strategic capabilities to bear against 4 human researchers in a frontier station. But Elena was no longer thinking of herself as a researcher. She was thinking of herself as a representative of her species, standing at a moment that would define how humans were perceived by the rest of the galaxy. The Kithara had made a fundamental error in judgment, and Elena intended to make sure they understood exactly what that error was going to cost them. "Sarah, David," Elena called through the intercom. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes, make sure our sensor recordings survive. The rest of humanity needs to know what we learned here." "What did we learn?" Sarah asked. Elena looked out at the assembled alien army, then at the improvised arsenal her pack had created from maintenance equipment and scientific instruments. "We learned that humans don't need to be the strongest or the fastest to be the most dangerous. We just need to be too stubborn to know when we're beaten." The Kithara assault began with coordinated fire from weapons that could punch through reinforced metal like paper. But Elena was already moving, her packmates beside her, carrying the fight to enemies who had expected surrender. The galaxy was about to discover why evolution had produced only one species like humanity, and why that might have been enough. 3 hours later, when the Colonial Rescue Force finally arrived, they found a research station that had been turned into a fortress. They found improvised weapons that shouldn't have worked, but had proven devastatingly effective. They found the remains of an alien army that had learned too late what it meant to hunt humans on human terms. And they found 4 researchers who had just redefined what the rest of the galaxy would think about humanity for generations to come. Elena was sitting on the station's front steps when the rescue ships landed, still holding a plasma cutter and wearing a smile that would have made her ancestors proud. Behind her, the research station stood as proof that sometimes the prey becomes the predator, and sometimes the galaxy learns to be very, very careful about which species it chooses to threaten. The Kithara fleet withdrew from human space that same day. Their invasion plans were permanently shelved, replaced by protocols that classified humanity as a species too dangerous to engage directly. Elena returned to her academic career, but her research focus had changed permanently. She no longer studied predator behavior in controlled laboratory settings. Instead, she became the galaxy's foremost expert on something no one had thought to study before: what happens when human beings decide they've had enough. The hook in the darkest corners of the galaxy, where civilized species fear to tread, there exists a truth that few dare to speak. Humans are not the weak, fragile creatures the universe believes them to be. There is something far more dangerous, something that defies every law of nature and survival that governs intelligent life. When the Kithara pack, apex predators of the Veil Nebula, set their sights on what appeared to be helpless prey, they expected an easy hunt. What they discovered instead would shake the foundations of galactic civilization and force every species in known space to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the strange bipedal beings from the third planet of Sol. This is not a story of humanity's technology or their weapons of war. This is a story about something far more primal, something that runs in their very blood and speaks to the ancient darkness that made them the ultimate survivors on a death world they call home. The Kithara thought they were the hunters. They were wrong.